the federal level, and there are rules on that. On the net energy metering, I don't know. But that's a good question, but I don't know the answer. Okay.
Seems to be local. In Seattle, they have to do it.
But that's probably
Future
the
power.
utility commission.
That's probably local, yeah.
So I know because the rates are, are regulated at the state level, I know that they have the jurisdiction whether or not there is that same push from the federal level on demand response, but on net energy metering as there is on demand response. I'm not aware of, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Okay, we talked about, somebody asked a question about wind. So this is similar to the solar insolation map. This is the wind map for the United States. And you can see here the scale, I'm sorry it's fuzzy, but the colors indicate increasing wind as we go here. So you can see most of the really great wind resource is either offshore or up Tornado Valley. And I did not realize until I was preparing this that, let me get the number right, that the United States has 90% of the world's tornadoes. That kind of floored me. I guess with all of the we've seen over the last couple of years of destruction, maybe that's, but I mean this is, and it may be because we've, got this long north-south corridor without much topography. I'm not really sure what the geography and meteorology is, but that was kind of floored me. So, and of course, we've got the issue off of Martha's Vineyard where you've got the great resource, but nobody wants to see the, the windmills. I think a lot of renewable perception is also societal. I think the Danes have a different view of seeing windmills than we do in the United States. Or anyway, I mean, you just see so many windmills everywhere, and I know some people think they're beautiful and they don't have a problem with it. Other people think it's a scar on the landscape. So anyway, but that was just a small thing on wind. Another really interesting fact that I was not aware of until I started doing some transportation analysis. So plug-in electric vehicles, the load for a plug-in electric vehicle is about the same load as your house. So increasing penetration of plug-in electric vehicles is not an insignificant feat. And I think if I were starting all over, I'd either get into energy storage or I would get into controls, because this is all going to depend on control strategy and smart charging strategy. We all are creatures of habit. We all want things to be easy. I want to come home, pull into my garage, plug in my electric vehicle. I don't have one, but if I did have one, I'd want to plug it in, have it charged, ready to go when I was ready to go. But if we all did that, we would probably bring down the grid if we had enough penetration of these vehicles. So the smart charging strategies, there's a lot of work being done. I'm working at the University of California at Irvine has a program where they're looking at smart charging strategies and what is the smartest charging strategy. But we're going to have to, kind of like our air conditioners for demand response, we're going to have to give up that control probably to our utilities and allow them to charge when it makes most sense and when it has the least impact on the grid, which will probably be at 2 in the morning for most of us. And we have some things. I'm going to go down here to the consumer issues. The main thing is I want my car to be ready when I want my car to be ready. And so we're just going to have to rethink a little bit how we're going to do that smart charging. And of course I have to have a charging station available if I'm away from home and I'm going to run out of battery. How fast it can charge really depends on the size of the battery, how far, the state of charge, how much charge is left in it, how big is the charger that you're using, and how much current do you have available. So these are all things that we're going to have to deal with. We're going to have a lot of new infrastructure for home charging, etc. But this is, if you don't remember anything else, it's really important to recognize that an electric car is a significant load, and it's one that's going to have to be managed. Okay, I think enough on that. Okay, Q, quantify to clarify. This is was done in 2005 prior to the California Solar Initiative coming into effect, and how much of a role, if any, it played. Different people have different attitudes about that. But we call it the solar waterfall, kind of because it looks like a waterfall. And it was really an attempt to have in one photo, one kind of leave behind for a regulator, an educational piece on where we think the value is that rooftop, and this is rooftop PV, where that value is, and really the bottom line was to try and say, we think the value ranges from, at this time when this is outdated, 7.8 to 22.4 cents per kilowatt hour. So you, as the regulator, could justify, based on this analysis, a feed-in tariff somewhere within that range. And the reason the analysis is chopped up the way it is, I think the contribution of this waterfall was not a lot of independent analysis on any one of these pieces, but it was bringing it all together in one place and saying, this is what we think the bottom line value is. And it's based on, the reason the range is so great is that it's really based on, as a starting point, what's the technology that you're avoiding if you put photovoltaics on your roof? Well, it kind of depends. It may be a natural gas combined cycle plant that's kind of a load follower. If you are contributing on peak, it might be a peaker. And so because of the differences in their operations and efficiencies, that's what contributes to the range. And I won't go over this in complete detail, but just to give you some idea, California is a very good state to do analysis in because they do a lot of it. And they have a lot of kind of repeated analyses that get updated, that they know, that they rely on, that you can start with and not have to be recreating the wheel. So what they did when they started moving towards a renewable portfolio standard is they created an annually a market price referent, which is called the MPR. And that was the costs broken down in a lot of these categories of a brand new combined cycle plant. So if you are, and the whole purpose, a large part of the purpose of the MPR was, we are going to require increased levels of renewable energy. What is the premium that that's going to cost to the state, to the investor-owned utility? And then they created a fund basically to help offset that premium. So they used the brand new natural gas combined cycle, which they assumed you would have been building if you were building solar or wind. They used that as the metric and calculated the difference on top of that. So that was something that came out every year for a number of years. So when you're talking about what's the value of PV, you can start with that brand new combined cycle and say, okay, I'm not going to have to build that combined cycle, maybe. What do I avoid in the capital costs associated with that? And you can see here's what we use, this effective load carrying capacity. We called it at that point 65%. And that has to do with how much of your PV capacity actually is available when the load peaks. Because remember I said a lot of the load peaks late in the afternoon. The solar peak is at noon or 1, depending on which, if you're on daylight savings time. So this effective load carrying capacity, I can't say I'm going to offset up all of my capacity is going to offset a natural gas combined cycle because my peak does not correspond to the system peak. So all kinds of categories here, avoided transmission costs. We're assuming that all the costs of that transmission, kind of go back to our pizza slide, that all of that gets allocated to the summer peak because that's when we have the highest transmission. We've got to build that. Distribution costs. And again, California is just a great place to do analysis because on this avoided distribution cost, part of the reason this range is so high, because this doesn't have anything to do with generation, they do a lot of avoided cost analysis there, looking at, for instance, San Diego Gas and Electric, you're very dense population, very expensive to put in your distribution capacity. So they're setting the high end of our avoided distribution cost, and the low end is going to be somewhere out in the San Joaquin Valley where nobody's living. So Each of these has a different rationale for the range. We talked about the hedge. Lawrence Berkeley Lab has done some work on the value of, what is the value of the hedge value of renewables. So this is based on their analysis. The avoided generation cost, remember this is 2005, so prices were higher than they are now. And would be, you know, kind of the base load combined cycle versus the peaker operating very inefficiently.
Why did they only use natural gas? Why did they include nuclear and?
Because typically this is because it's not a base load technology in this case. And I'll show another slide next that actually does include coal, for instance, because it is a base load technology. Some of the things that are, of course, very near and dear to those of us who live in the West, you know, how much water are you avoiding because you're not doing cooling of your natural gas combined cycle plant? So I really tried, you know, what are the CO2 emissions that you're avoiding? And in this, we had a range from, I think, $8 per ton to $29 per ton. $29.29 is equal to $100 per ton of carbon. I don't think we're probably going to see much above that because at some point we're going to have an out if we think we're ruining the economy. Different criteria pollutants, value of health benefits. This was new. And a lot of this, the reason that it's all sliced and diced like this, in some part goes to benefits like the value of health benefits. We all probably intuitively feel if we avoid using a fossil fuel in favor of a renewable that doesn't have any, you know, emissions or, and this is all at the generation point, and, you know, it's not a full life cycle cost. But we all kind of intuitively feel like if the air is cleaner, there's probably going to be some health benefits. But wow, try and quantify those, okay? So a reason that slice and dice it like this is because if I'm talking to a policymaker who has an aversion to any one of these slices and says, well, and the health benefits has really been the biggest one where people have said, you can't put a number on that. And I'm like, if you don't put a number, you're either saying it's zero, we intuitively don't believe it's zero. If you say it's infinity, I don't believe you. So if I give this to a policymaker and they have a bias, you know, for or against any one of these components, they might say, you know, I don't believe this value of health benefits. I'm just going to say that's zero. It's kind of like, that's fine, just deduct it from here. But it doesn't undermine all of the other components that we think have value.
Could be a sacrificial lamb, they might be roasted alone.
Exactly, exactly. So again, I think the contribution of this was that it put it all in one place, kind of a colorful, eye-catching graphic, and it allowed you to pick and choose what you believed. And if you might say, well, I don't believe, you know, this was in 2005, none of us anticipated the shale gas revolution. You know, you might have said, well, you know, I don't think, and I used a 3-year history on prices so that we had an actual, you know, prices that we'd actually seen. You might have had a more optimistic or less optimistic view on natural gas prices. You might say, oh, I think this should be twice, or I think it should be half. Anyway, so this was with respect to solar rooftop PV. People like the analysis, so I did a similar analysis. Actually, I've done it several times for fuel cells. Now, fuel cells is a technology that not a lot of people are familiar with. It's not a combustion technology. It's a chemical process. So very low emissions, very quiet, and it is a base load technology. So much different than many other emerging technologies. Can operate on digester gas, which is up here. Typically it would operate on natural gas, and it has a lot of high value heat. So you can use fuel cells in combined heat and power and increase the efficiency enormously. So this is the same type of analysis, but you can see the numbers are quite different. And the numbers are different depending on whether or not you're operating on natural gas, because then you have a natural gas cost for the fuel cell. If you're using renewable fuel, which would be digester gas, say from a dairy or even a landfill, then your avoided generation fuel cost goes up enormously and you get a much better bottom line. Now, one of the things that happens in renewable fuel, California had at this time it was at least double. If you operated your facility using renewable digester gas you would get double the incentive that you would get otherwise. So what happened, and the idea was that you would, the intent was that you would create this market for renewable digester gas fuel in California, but they didn't say it had to be sourced in California. So everybody went to Texas, where there's a lot more digester gas, and the Texas digester gas folks basically got all of those incentives because they doubled the price. They knew you were going to get double the price, and so the intent of the policy turned out different than, markets will always work. You may not anticipate how they work, but they will always work, and people will always find the loophole. That's our nature. So they've since changed that regulation so that it has to be sourced in California to get that bonus. But in this case, the avoided technologies were a natural gas combined cycle again, on the one hand. On the other hand, it was baseload coal, because California imports a lot of coal from the Southwest. Imports a lot of electricity generated using coal from my part of the country, from the Southwest. The Four Corners area has two large, very dirty coal-fired plants that have been in part owned by the California utilities. So we got a lot of pushback on that. We actually sent this to several of the agencies for review, and they said, well, you can't talk about coal because those contracts were going to roll off the board, and the California utilities were no longer going to have ownership in those coal-fired plants. And so they said, well, we're not going to be importing coal-fired generation anymore. And we pushed back very strongly and said, well, your name might not be on it, but fact of the matter is, yes, you are. And so we did maintain the coal component here, but we got a lot of pushback because nobody wants to admit that they're using coal-fired generation. So again, that's where the range, repowered coal versus natural gas. And by this time, and I believe this is the 2011 update, we had, lower, actually we were still, because I used a 3-year history, we still had some of that high cost natural gas in there. If you were to redo this today, because of how gas prices had come down, these components would be smaller, the generation fuel cost. So again, another reason to break it out, because particularly with respect to volatile fuel prices, it's important to be able to separate that and not lose validity of everything else you've done. So these are the so-called waterfall analyses, and some people like them and some people think you can't do that. So our renewable portfolio standards, this is the major policy driver for renewables. If you're investing in solar, if you're investing in wind, beware of policy changes, because as long as you're being supported by government subsidies, if those subsidies go away, your industry and your return is going to dramatically change. If you're not familiar with Desire, is how we say it, if you're not familiar with this website, you should be. It is a really valuable resource for maps like this one. I pulled this directly off of their website. They also have text. They've got lots and lots of maps. They have state-by-state detail on each of these renewable portfolio standards. So I commend it to you if you're not familiar with it. Point that I wanted to make is that there's a lot of renewable portfolio standards in a lot of states. And some of them are mandates, some of them are goals. So you can see the difference here. The red ones are standards, which you're required to meet if you're typically an investor-owned utility. The orange ones are goals. We'd like you to meet that. If for some reason you can't, there's usually an out. In some cases, even with the renewable portfolio standard, if the costs become too onerous, sometimes there's an out there as well. And then there's certain details here. You can see where the little sun is. Colorado being one of those cases. That's saying, because solar is so much more expensive than wind, if you just say you have to have renewables and you have wind, people are going to build wind. So in many states, all of these with the sun, there is a specific set aside for solar that says you have to meet this renewable portfolio standard, and oh, by the way, a certain piece of it has to be solar. Or I believe it also customer sited, or it has to be solar so you could build a large-scale solar plant, not on-site, or if there's a customer site requirement, that would almost require PV of some sort. So every state is different, and The other thing is that you can't compare directly, you know, it says, okay, here, and I don't know the specifics of all the states, but I'll just say New York's 29% and let's get two that are the same. New Mexico 20% and I think I saw Kansas 20%. What they define as renewables may be different. So you really have to go, you know, again, the devil in policy is always in the details. You really have to go into the details of the legislation behind each state to know what qualifies as renewables. Sometimes it all has to be new renewables, and if you already have PV, it doesn't count. So again, kind of the jurisdiction definition issues, make sure you know what the rules really are.
I'm curious because it seems like there's a kind of a contiguous cluster of states that aren't participating. Is there some driver behind that?
TVA, I would say, low-cost coal.
Florida's got a lot of dirty coal.
Yeah. So that may be a glib response, but that's my
No,
that's my
I
immediate
figured it was
reaction.
something intuitive like that.
Yeah.
So,
Georgia actually doesn't use a whole lot of coal power. They use a lot of hydro.
Okay,
Yeah.
so maybe they in effect already have,
Yeah, right.
have met a renewable.
Yeah, I think it's political. You know, I mean, you're probably right though about cost.
Well, I shouldn't necessarily say TVA. I should say low-cost coal.
Yeah.
I should say low-cost energy.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is really what I meant. It wasn't a slam on TVA, but I think when you have low-cost electricity, you're less inspired to pay the extra premium. Large hydro is often excluded from the definition of renewable because people don't think we should be building more dams. So again, you need to make sure you know what qualifies when you're trying to meet a renewable portfolio standard. Okay, this is just to go to my really opening point on renewable portfolio standards. You know, renewables aren't going to happen as long as you're higher cost unless we have a policy commitment. And that policy commitment can be driven by climate change issues, it can be driven by social issues, it can be driven by anything that drives policymakers. So part of that waterfall analysis I showed you is if you have a renewable portfolio standard and if you have options for what type of, well, you always have options, of what type of renewables you're going to use, we want to meet that policy commitment, in my opinion, in the most cost-effective manner possible. So if you do some type of a quantitative analysis of different technologies, you can look at them and say, okay, fuel cells are great, they're base load, they can operate on, renewable fuel. They could take this base load piece. We've got, solar could make the peaking part. Wind, particularly if you can put some storage on, has more flexibility. So it kind of goes back to that, rank the options, meet your policies always,